Hey everybody, so my research study is on adultification and education. And if you don't know right now what adultification is, it's not a problem. I'll explain it momentarily. But first, the best place to start a research study with the research question. That's the foundation of the whole thing after all. So my research question reads, what are the effects of adultification on high school and college education? Diving right in, adultification. Adultification is a social phenomenon in which a child takes on the household roles of a parent or is prematurely exposed to adult information. That's the formal definition. It can be a bit of a mouthful. What it really is when a child does things in the house that are normally expected of the parent instead of the parent. So that can be cooking for the family, cleaning up after other siblings, taking care of those siblings, managing the household finances, or other things of that nature. Or where the child is exposed to information that's just way beyond their age level. And experts have agreed on 4 forms in which adultification can manifest. The first is called precocious knowledge. That's when the child is exposed to this information above their age level. It's usually due to cramped quarters, so adults have nowhere to go to discuss these sensitive matters. And these can be things like, violence or drugs or even sexual material. Second form is called mentored adultification. That's when the parent of the household or the caretaker mentors the child into this parent role. So they'll start by teaching them like how to cook for a lot of people, how to do these finances, how to clean up after everybody, and then sort of lead them into doing it on their own. Purification/spousification is when the parent of the child stops treating their child like their child and instead starts treating them like their peer or their spouse. So this can look like, gossiping about the household, complaining about the other siblings. And this is dangerous because, it strips the child of this parent figure and it replaces it with a potentially dependent friend or spouse character. And then parentification, that's when the child fully takes on the roles of the parent without the help of the parent. So they're doing everything you would normally expect the parent to do. All the household tasks, all the finances. In some cases, if the family doesn't speak English, the child will have to translate for the parents. And adultification is mainly caused by poverty. When the parent has to work 2 to 3 jobs, they're leaving the house early, they're coming home late, they're never home. They can't do these household tasks, the responsibility falls to the child. It can also be caused by substance abuse or a really severe illness, or something else that inhibits the parent from doing these tasks, and thus the responsibility again falls to the child, but most commonly it is poverty. And interestingly, research suggests that Black girls are the race and gender combo that are most prone to adultification. So, what are the links between adultification and education? Well, experts have shown that adultification can have both positive and negative consequences in terms of education. That's really interesting, and I'll get more into that later. But in terms of positive educational outcomes, adultification builds these mental and emotional resilience skills because the youth is forced to do all these things that they normally don't want to do. They want to be hanging out with their friends, they're doing other normal child things, and instead they're doing these parent roles. They can not always gain these resilience skills, perseverance skills, and time management and problem solving skills if they try to do all these things and also try to live a normal child's life. And we're all students, we can imagine, or we know how important it is to persevere and have good time management or problem solving skills in an academic setting. So if these skills do manifest themselves later in an academic setting, it's clear how that could be beneficial for the youth. In terms of the negative educational outcomes, because parent or adultification limits how much time the youth has, because they have to do all these household tasks, they'll have less time to spend on homework and studying. And then in more extreme cases, it could completely remove the child's ability to attend school altogether. So, that's obvious how that would negatively affect education if you can't go to school, or you can't study or do homework. And then, so where does my study come into place? So all studies examining this relationship so far have been qualitative studies, non-quantitative, within college psychology departments. So basically, a psychology professor will derive some way to measure the extent of adultification. They'll pay college students to come in, take their test, and then measure it against some educational outcome, maybe grades or standardized test scores or class rank or something of that nature. And that's that. So the problem is this doesn't capture, it's very limited in sample size, very limited in sample diversity, and my study wants to do something different. So my study is a national longitudinal survey meant to measure the relationship between adultification and education. This study would include a large and diverse sample from youth across the country that would allow me to employ more advanced mathematical statistical methods and control for the expected confounders, which, like I mentioned earlier, would be race and gender. Unfortunately, there isn't any data set like this out there that really seeks to measure this connection. This necessitates my study because this connection hasn't been examined on the level I'm proposing yet. The one data set that does come closest to measuring this relationship, in my opinion, is the NLSY 97. That stands for National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, starting in the year 1997. This is a survey ran by the government meant to create a picture, general idea of youth life in America. Excuse me. It consists of two samples. One typical random sample like you'd see in a standard social science survey, and an oversample of minority races, specifically Black and Hispanic, to make sure that these races are accounted for in the analysis. The NLSY 97 had a sample size of almost 8,984 from different cities across the USA, and although it didn't really have constructs that I felt confident in saying measure adultification, they weren't specific enough in my opinion. It did have the closest available of all the data sets I looked at, so I plan to use a preliminary analysis of this dataset to help shape my survey instrument and explain and drive its necessity. So that brings us to the survey instrument. The way I plan to measure adultification is with the University of Iowa Parentification Inventory. This is a small survey. It's 22 questions created by the University of Iowa Adult Parentification Research Lab. And it's widely recognized by experts in the field as the gold standard for measuring adultification in a survey manner. In terms of educational outcome, I'm dividing that into three parts. The first is academic achievement. So that focuses on the more standard measures of academic achievement, stuff we're all used to, GPA, and standardized test scores, the ACT and the SAT. The reason I'm choosing to measure these things is, one, I think it would be interesting to not only measure the expected theoretical effects, but just measure how well they actually do in school in terms of how much they've been adultified. And two, these terms, GPA and national standardized tests, are kind of the standard method for measuring educational outcome in social science experiments. The second section, are the positive theoretical effects that I talked about earlier. So that's resilience skills, perseverance skills, problem-solving skills, like I mentioned. And then the negative theoretical effects, the amount of time available to commit to homework and studying, and the frequency of attendance. And then, because I explained that race and gender would be expected confounders, my survey instrument would also control for these. So, before the big national study, I would lead with a pilot study. The smaller scale study, but it's the same questions, same goal. So I'm looking for a sample size of about 100 here in just 2 or 3 low-income neighborhoods. and not surveyed, and not renewed every year, not re-interviewed every year. Maybe like just 1 year or maybe 2 years if it goes really well. And what I want to do is use the result from that to refine my research questions, figure out what works, what doesn't work, implement those changes, and test how effective my instruments are. So, how do I plan to implement the big survey? I'm going to do like what the NLSY 97 did with 2 samples, the cross sample and the minority oversample. That's important for my survey because I expect race to be a confounder. So I need to make sure I have all races adequately represented in my data. The sample size I'm looking for is about 10,000, more or less would be okay, just somewhere around that order of magnitude, of youth aged 15 to 18, because that would be students in high school or college in low-income neighborhoods across the country. I'm choosing low-income neighborhoods because, as I explained, that's the primary indicator of adultification, and I can't really look at like a neighborhood where all the adults have some severe illness. That's not really something that exists. So I'm choosing low income, and then re-interviewed yearly to get a time scale of this effects, see how these adultification consequences manifest over time. So I'm going to employ door-to-door screening for eligible participants in these neighborhoods. So people come, knock on the door, just ask a couple questions like who lives here, what kind of people live here, to get an idea of if there are eligible participants in that household. And then once I have all my eligible participants, I could re-interview them for the survey. And I would make sure to give interviewers a script to follow to combat confirmation bias. So how do I plan to analyze the data after my survey is implemented? I plan on creating 4 variables, one independent adultification variable from the parentification inventory results. That inventory explains how to create a numerical variable with the results, so not a lot of work there required on my end. And then 3 dependent education variables, one for each of the educational aspects I was planning on looking at, just to refresh that academic achievement, and then the positive and negative theoretical consequences of adultification. And for the ones that are measured numerically, like ACT, SAT, and GPA, I can just create a weighted average as my variable. For the ones that are categorical, I'll use a 1 to 5 scale, and then again create a weighted average. And then I'll use dummy variables for race and gender. So for example, dummy variable for Hispanic would be 1 if the respondent was Hispanic and 0 otherwise. That'll help me to control for those in my linear regression models, where I'll regress the independent variable with each of the 3 dependent variables to look for the relationship. So, into the NLSY preliminary analysis. Like I said, there were no variables in this that really I thought hit the nail on the head with measuring adultification. So here are the 3 that I chose to look at because I thought they came closest. The first is parental monitoring. This is an average of actually 2 variables from the NLSY survey, monitoring from the mother and monitoring from the father. Those are on a scale from 0 to 16. So for this new variable, I've averaged them. The reason I picked this variable is I thought it would actually play an inverse role with adultification. The more parental monitoring the child receives, theoretically, the less adultified they are. Because obviously if the parent's watching them, then the parent can also just do the role that the child would be doing if they were adultified. Self-assessed autonomy, this one's pretty explanatory. The more autonomous a child is, the more possibilities they might be adultified because they're doing everything for themselves. They're not receiving help from their parents. That's on a scale from 0 to 6, with 6 being the most autonomous. And the last one is how much the respondent thinks helping others is important on a scale from 0 to 5. My thought process here was the more value they attach to helping others, the more they would be willing to sort of let themselves be adultified in order to help their family. And then my dependent variables and controls. My dependent variables are the same as in the academic achievement outcome from my studies, that's GPA, ACT, and SAT. Important to note that GPA is measured without the decimal place. So a GPA of 3.29 would be recorded as 329. Obviously, I would have also loved to look at the expected positive and negative theoretical consequences of adultification. This survey really doesn't have those. And then I'm using dummy variables for Black, Hispanic, mixed but not Hispanic, and a male. The mixed and not Hispanic might seem a little weird, but that's the race options the survey offered, and that's so they can make sure that they have Black and Hispanic adequately represented in their survey. And then the methods I used. So the big problem I ran into when analyzing my data was that a lot of the variables were full of missing values. So like 50%, 60, 80% even missing values. So the first thing I tried to do to fix this was mean and median imputation, where I just replaced all the missing values with the mean or the median of that variable. The reason this didn't work for me was because there were so many missing values. The mean and the median made up like 80% of the variable, so like 80% of the variable is one number, which causes the correlation coefficient in the linear regression to go to 0 really, really quickly. So when I tried these methods, I was getting coefficients on the order of like 10 to the negative third or 10 to the negative fourth. Next method I tried was the one that I ended up settling on. It's called pairwise deletion, which is where each regression only looks at all the cases where there's no missing value for the respective independent and dependent variable. So the downside of this is that not all my regressions had the same sample, so it's not really fair to talk about the effects, the results of my different regressions as if they're all talking about the same sample, but they do all still come from the same sample, so it still provides some insight into the relationships, and it's definitely more effective than the imputation methods. And then, yeah, like you probably guessed, I did a linear regression for each combination of independent and dependent variables. So we'll go take a look at those results now. So here's the first. It's the effects of parental monitoring, the first independent variable, on GPA, the first dependent variable. So in each of these regressions, I did one with no controls, one where I only controlled for race, and one where I controlled for race and gender. And then out of these three, I looked at the ones that had the highest significance level, that's indicated by how many stars next to the number, and in the event that that was a tie, I would look at the highest R squared among the highest significance level. So for example, in this regression, we see that each of the models has a significance level of 3 stars, which indicates p less than 0.01. But the third one, the one that controls for race and gender, has the highest R squared, so that's what I'm looking at. So in this model, we see a positive correlation between parental monitoring and GPA, which would indicate that the higher the parental monitoring, the higher the GPA, and because we said, if anything, the higher the parental monitoring, the lower the adultification. It's a negative correlation between adultification and GPA, so that would be a negative consequence of adultification. In the next 3 models, as you can tell, next 3 regressions, none of my models achieved a significance level of at least 1 star, which means I can't really draw any conclusions from them. That's unfortunate, but there are more models, so we trudge along. Looking at the effects of self-assessed autonomy on ACT scores, it's almost the same situation, but our first model, the one with no controls, does manage to hit that significance threshold. So we can say that the higher there's a correlation between self-assessed autonomy and ACT scores, which would be a positive consequence of adultification. Looking at SAT scores, we see the same, just at a much higher significance level. That the higher the adultification level, the higher the SAT score. That's more positive consequences. In the next 2 models, that's helping others and GPA and helping others and ACT. We don't hit that significant threshold. And then the last one, we do, and we see a negative correlation, between the importance of helping others and ACT scores, which would indicate a negative consequence for adultification. So, I did back to this PowerPoint. We see that 5 out of 9 of my models were statistically insignificant, which is kind of a bummer, because we can't draw any conclusions from those, but we still were able to make some conclusions from the other 4, and we did see both positive and negative consequences, which is good for my study, because it means the theoretical foundation is there. There are positive and negative consequences, and it also necessitates my study, because it means that my study would be required to do a larger scale analysis with more specific adultification constructs like my parentification inventory to get a better sense of this adultification and education relationship. So yeah, that's my research study. Thank you so much for listening.